Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar, 1984 and Its Afterlives. This webinar will begin with a moderated discussion between our panelists and our moderator, after which we will have time for Q&A from the audience. So please drop your questions in the chat and be sure to include where you're asking from. Before I turn it over to today's moderator, I would like to introduce you to everyone. We'll start with Dr. Shruti Devgan. Shruti Devgan is an assistant professor of sociology at Bowdoin College. She's currently working on a book on the digital, intergenerational, and diasporic memories of the 1984 anti-Sikh violence. Suchitra Vijayan is an essayist, lawyer, and photographer working across oral history, state violence, and visual storytelling. She's the author of the critically acclaimed book, Midnight's Borders, People's History of Modern India, and How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? Voices of Indian Political Prisoners. Next, we have Sukhman Singh Dhami, who is the co-founder and executive director of INSAF, a human rights organization working to end impunity and achieve justice for crimes against humanity in India, with a focus on Punjab. And lastly, we have Professor Uma Chakravarti, who is a distinguished feminist historian who has taught at Miranda House College for Women at Delhi University. She writes on Buddhism, early Indian history, the 19th century, and contemporary issues. Among her publications are Delhi Riots, 3 Days in the Life of a Nation, and many edited volumes. She's closely involved with the women's movement and the movement for democratic rights in India. She has been part of many fact-finding teams to investigate human rights violations, communal violence, and state repression. I will throw it over to Shruti now.
Thanks very much, Manvinder, for those introductions and for helping start today's discussion. I'd also like to thank IkOankar, the creative director of the Sikh Research Institute, and everyone else at SikhRI who worked in putting together this webinar. I'm extremely grateful to our panelists for taking the time to join us today. Professor Chakravarti, Suchitra, Sukhman, all of them do important and much needed work in documenting state violence and pursuing the cause of justice in their respective ways. So I'm really thankful for all of their inspiring and encouraging efforts and looking forward to learning from all of them. And of course, thanks to our audience for taking the time to join us for this important discussion. As we know, it's the 40th year anniversary of the 1984 violence, and this includes both the June and October-November horrors, as well as the years preceding 1984 and the time following it. Among other reasons, we remember 1984 to honor the lives lost, the living dead, the disappeared, others living liminal or in-between lives. We remember as a form of resistance to the Indian state's narrative and to forge connections between generations and stories spread across time and space. We decided to call today's discussion 1984 and Its Afterlives because on this 40th year anniversary of the violence, we also remember the events to make connections with the ongoing and durable violence against Sikhs, but also Muslims and other minority groups, both in India as well as in the diaspora. Given how the violence, criminalization, and dehumanization of certain individuals and groups is becoming increasingly normative and or visible, I've been thinking a lot about what the scholar called Michael Rothberg calls the idea, or calls implicated subjects. And broadly speaking, what that idea means is it encourages us to go beyond the binary of victim and perpetrators and calls upon all of us to reflect on our social positions and identities. And so to quote Rothberg, he says, implicated subjects occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves direct agents of harm. They contribute to inhabit, inherit, or benefit from regimes of domination, but do not originate or control such regimes. And I evoked this idea because I hope that today's discussion will help us understand many facets of 1984 and its enduring consequences, but also ask each of us to reflect on our positions and the big and small ways in which we can talk back to dominant stories and structures. So in terms of the format, I'll start by asking our panelists some questions, and then I'll open up the floor to audience questions in maybe the last half an hour or so. So without further delay, please let's start. And I'm going to start with Professor Chakravarti. So Professor Chakravarti, your book on the anti-Sikh violence in Delhi might have been one of the first, if not the very first book containing stories and testimonies of 1984. And so if you can please talk about the reasons or the process by which the book first came about, so what went into it. And if you'd like, if you want to briefly share one story or testimony from the book or your more recent work, that'll be great.
Okay. So to start with, actually, the book that I and Nandita Haksar, she was my student. I was she'd been my student in Miranda House, and so we collaborated in doing the interviews and so on. But the whole process, in my own understanding and in a sense in the unfolding of the history of documentation, is actually the work that the PUDR PUCL did in first writing that report called "Who Are the Guilty," and that report actually indicted a large number of people for the failures as being implicated in the responsibility for the manner in which that violence had actually unfolded. Its focus was on, in some ways, its focus was an early stage in challenging the command responsibility. That is an issue that we all came up with later on, But in 84, we did not have those kind of analytical tools or those labels by which we could indict and say who is actually responsible for the failure to protect citizenry. And of course, the fact that this is a massive riot. It's not that other riots hadn't happened, but this was a massive riot, and it was happening right here in the capital, and so on. So it had a certain drama about it. And from the point of view of our own history, the fact that the Sikhs and the had been part of the same formation with the Hindus at the time of the partition made it particularly tragic as far as 84 was concerned, because then now you found that the Sikhs were being targeted in post-independent India. And this is one of the issues that came up, that humko apne desh, apne watan mein hi mara. And that was considered to be a kind of betrayal, which was an extraordinary kind. Now, many of us who got involved with the writing of that report and so on, and this is an important issue, it isn't, the Sikh community was actually holed up, and it was not in a position to come out and say anything. The response had to come from civil society, which was largely, I don't even want to get into those labels. There were a large number of them were non-Sikhs. There were a number of what is now would be called Hindus. But I wouldn't see myself as a Hindu who responded. I'd see myself as an Indian citizen who responded to what was happening in her country. So in some ways, the shock of that incident, which was so huge and such large numbers had gotten killed, meant that we knew it not only that we had to indict those who were responsible, but very quickly, because I'm a historian, it became a question of we need to actually go out there, and it's the first, I think, serious oral history project that happened, perhaps in post-independence India, because in 84, then I felt that we've got to document and we've got the stories. So the state will put out its narrative, but we also need to get the people's narratives and their experience of the violence. And I kept talking about it, and Nandita, who was my student and who's a doer, she said, "So what's the problem? Let's just do it." And she got hold of a few tape recorders and so on. And we were a group of 6 people, and we went off and we collected these stories of people who had suffered. But as we did that, we also made sure that we had others who were not directly victims or survivors of the violence, but also sometimes people who had been implicated in the rioting. We were told that they are, and we often did other members of the community who may have had a slightly qualified position as far as their own relationship to responding to the violence was concerned. I do remember that one of the things that I wanted to do was to track the stories, not only from the survivors, but from those who witnessed it. And I had a range, we sorted out a range of people that we went and spoke to, which included young children in schools, and then went all the way to, older people who had lived through not only the partition, but, had engaged in Sikh history in a certain kind of way. So that was the broad kind of, let's say, impetus to do this. And it was in the background, it was that we don't want this narrative to be taken over by the state, and then you get a statist view of what happened rather than a people's view of what happened. And so that's the broad framework. If you'd like me to, I would like to speak of one. There were the collection is marked by a large number of people of differing ages, different professions, different trainings, and so on. But perhaps the one, if I have to reduce my story to one person, which I think ties up with our questions of impunity, it's the account of Phanda Singh. Phanda Singh was a survivor of he was an older person. He was in his, I think, already in his 60s. He lost 2 sons. Tragically for me, the recording failed. The tape recorder did not work, but I made copious notes, and I have them. I still have them in my handwriting. Those notes, and I was the only person who was whom he was speaking to. It was an extraordinary journey. For one of the things that he was like a balladeer. He told his story like the displaced person, and he took it back to the partition because he had been a young boy at the time of partition, and they had come from Sindh. So there was a long journey that he makes, and he described it in the style of the balladeer. This is where we were, this is what happened, this is how we came. And he peopled it with, people like Gandhiji and Nehru come in as characters in the story that he told. And then he talked about this journey in which they have to be resettled. And they were settled finally in Rajasthan. Now, I want to flag this, that is, the worst massacres happened in the resettlement colonies, which was the place where the Siklikar Sikhs showed up. Labania Sikhs and the Siklikar Sikhs were settled. And Phanda Singh was one of them. So this is the trajectory he comes in. And it was really quite tragic because he describes how they come. They don't have settled places. Finally, they come to Delhi. And then he said, and then Panditayan gave us 25 square yards. And finally, they felt that they had settled, that we got our little plots. But that's the place which was the site of this furious violence, And so Phanda Singh's account then not only had this sense of this great betrayal, but it also was extremely fair. Now, this is something that I want to point out because, you could turn the story into revenge. How do there were a series of bombings and terrorist attacks. Forget about terrorism, but attacks, that targeted attacks maybe, and so on. Phanda Singh was aware. I raised it with Phanda Singh, and I said to him, it said, and he said, firstly, he dropped 2 things. One of the things that people tried to say was it was the poor and uneducated and the riffraffs that attacked the Sikhs, that attacked these colonies. And so I said to him, log कहते हैं कि चूड़े चमारों ने किया. And he gave this brilliant, absolutely, I've never forgotten those words. He said, सबने मारा, बनियों ने मारा, ब्राह्मणों ने मारा, जिसने कभी चूहा नहीं मारा उसने भी मारा, you know. So he was absolutely, he was a real eyewitness and a non partisan eyewitness. And then he turned around and he said, we don't want this revenge, you know, we don't want this business. We want कानूनी कार्रवाई हो, कानून के द्वारा हमको न्याय मिले. That, I think, has been the call. And for all of us who have been part of that movement of accountability, that is it. It's the search for justice. And the justice that is the only way. It's the first one. Reparations and all will come later on. Justice itself must be done. And that is that, and it must come from the courts. So it has to come from the official structure. It has to come from those places. So I think that's the story that I would like to flag for you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakravarti. That was really, there was a lot there, and that was a very evocative story that you shared with us. And your work, of course, is really valuable because, like you're saying, it was one of the first counter narratives to the state, right? Collecting people's stories and resisting the state narrative is such an important part of this work that you and everyone else who's on the panel is doing. Because the story of 1984 really still has been monopolized in a big way by the Indian state and how they had controlled media at the time. And so your work is really valuable. And also what you said in terms of, how the caste and class dimension, both in terms of who was targeted, but also the perpetrators, like you just said, Fanda Singh told you that it was everyone. So the wide-ranging nature of violence in that way. And also you brought up your positionality. And I'll go back to that question a little bit because I grapple with that question a lot as someone who's Punjabi but is not Sikh. I reflect on my positionality a lot. So we'll go back to that question. So for now, I'm just going to keep going and, bring in other panelists. So for Suchitra, my question is, again, with the kind of work that Suchitra does and the writing that you do, I would like to, again, know a little bit about that. So both in your organization, the Polis Project that you helped found, and your books, especially Midnight's Borders, you cover a wide range of topics and communities, right? And all of, a lot of your work, again, centers on state violence, on borders, on storytelling. So if you can please tell us about how you became engaged in this work. And again, even though you cover a wide range of topics and communities, if you've encountered any relevant stories about 1984 or anything related to 1984 that you'd like to share or highlight with us, that'll be great.
Thank you so much. An absolute honor to be in conversation with all of you. I think for me, I write from a place of not knowing. For me, I trained as a lawyer, and my first work that I did post qualifying for the bar was to work for the tribunals for Yugoslavia and then Rwanda. And what really struck me was, as a young person who believed that institutional systems and justice and human rights really could find us solutions, and you find yourself in a tribunal that has already existed by the time I got to the tribunal in 2006. It had existed for a while. There was a documentation of what had happened in the genocide, and yet the demand for justice felt so incomplete. And what became the question that I'm still trying to answer and I haven't answered is, what does one do in the aftermath of immense violence and grotesque brutality? Where does one search for justice? Can one search for justice? Perhaps that's the first question. What does justice look like? Is justice just remembering? Is justice just acknowledging? And just as you try to understand questions of justice, you are then very quickly taken back to the moment of how did this violence even was allowed to happen, right? And those questions, again, I think it feels so real now as it did 20 years ago. I'm sure for many of us who've been doing this work, that question remains pertinent. So for me, a lot of my writing really, and a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that the Polis Project does, really is in service of trying to understand why and what. And we also don't want this work to simply be a catalog of documentation of horrors, because there's so much violence pornography that goes with it, where the spectacle of violence then justifies another violence. So we occupy this rather, I would say, a rather terrible place where we don't know. The documentation has to exist, and yet what does this documentation do? What are the ways in which we can then help these communities in resistance that we're documenting, then use this to what does it look like? And I think it looks like, and I think coming to terms with the fact that it looks very different because history and memory is so local. Often questions of justice itself is affected by who we are, where we are in the spectrum. So I would say that is really what informs the work that we do. And now in terms of Midnight's Borders, and for me, what was very important to acknowledge is that I am as old as the Sikh genocide, right? Like I am as old because I was, I was a baby when this happened, and then I am now of a certain age. So this struggle for justice is as old as I am, which also puts the whole context in questioning and understanding. The ways that I first encountered 1984 was actually not in India. I wasn't taught about the Sikh genocide in India. I was born and raised in India till I was 17. I leave India in 17 to go study. It is only when I leave India that for the first time, I encountered the word 1994 Sikh genocide is a large advertisement in I think 2004. In 2004 there was a large advertisement in the London Metro, which said, remembering the Sikh genocide. And for the first time, I had seen, not as a person who was taught this in school, not as a young person, but someone who saw the word Sikh genocide. And then for the first time, you're like, what is this genocide that I do not know about? And I was already an adult by that time. And then you realize, and then when you start kind of unraveling the threads, you then realize how powerful the Indian state narrative is, how violence is always framed as an exception and not the rule, how it is always framed within the narratives of, we tried our best, but we are perfect, we are secular, this is an exception, we are a democracy that is, we are still, I think that was the first thing. And then as I started writing Midnight's Borders, and you realize that communities talk about the acts of violence, and just as Professor Chakravarti spoke, it doesn't begin and end with 1984. It begins much before. Often one metaphor that emerged over and over again, and this is what Midnight's Borders opens with, is when someone asks my name, I say I'm someone who's lost my home many times over. The loss of home, not once, but twice. A sense that the home that is lost and the home that is found is never going to be yours. And there is this incredibly powerful moment that didn't make the book. Is a very dear friend of mine told me, a very dear friend of mine who's Pakistani said that, Suchitra, it always feels like we have our suitcases packed and it's in the middle of our living room. And always it's a metaphorical suitcase that is packed. And I want to end this. I do not want my nieces. Like, it feels like we have our bags packed in our living room. But imagine the metaphor of always feeling bags packed in your living room and never feeling. That definitely comes and repeats itself over and over again. Never as just one act of violence, but a series of violence that you're still not coming to terms with. And I think these are powerful ways for us to understand that citizenship and democracy and equality doesn't begin and end with constitutional guarantees. It really just is a foundation of human dignity. And I think violence, more than anything else, robs us of human dignity. And I think those are the ones. And I think by talking about this, and I think for people like Professor Chakravarti and the work that Sukhman does, and many, many people do, really is that fabric, right? Like, you begin this work, we are all standing on the shoulders of giants, where we continue to build an archive of stories that perhaps can tell us there is a better way to live. And I think that is where I would say our work kind of ends. But does it answer the questions of justice? Perhaps not.
Thanks so much, Suchitra. Really, so many thought-provoking things to take away from what you just shared. What is justice? Is it even possible when you've suffered so much horror and loss and suffering? Is it even possible? What does it look like? And also a really important point that you made about trying to strike a balance between documenting and cataloging these stories and violence, but also steering away from the spectacle of violence, right? The pornography of violence, like you said. So really important points. And what you also talked about in terms of the narrative or the story of 1984 and how you were not taught that in the Indian context. And so the context in which we grow up, what are the stories we learn, but also the kind of stories that we learn. So when I talked to Sikhs in the diaspora, many of them told me that they internalized the state story of 1984 and did not really question that, because the state blamed and shamed the Sikh community for the violence, and they did not question that for the longest time. So it took a lot of learning and unlearning and moving away from India for them to start sort of talking back to this dominant story of 1984. So Sukhman actually grew up, I think, mostly in the diaspora, and of course does really important work on, his organization, INSAF, does really important work on the disappeared and victims of extrajudicial violence. So if we can bring you in, Sukhman, if you can share about how you became engaged in this work, how you learned about 1984, and again, any story or case that INSAF might have documented or you might have come across personally that you'd like to share with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties on my end. Such a privilege to be here with you all. And you all have inspired me in many different ways. So thank you for your commendable work and contributions to these important issues. I am very much a product of the Sikh diaspora. And part of that experience certainly involved hearing about the atrocities that were unfolding in Punjab in the 80s and 90s. I have very clear memories of my own family receiving phone calls during that period where my parents were being informed about people that they knew, loved ones who had been disappeared or killed or tortured or had been rounded up in dragnet operations by India's security forces. I also have very clear memories of, again, I was a child at the time, so it took me a while to make sense of it, which happened, later on, of traveling to Punjab with my family and again, overhearing conversations about individuals who had been tortured and disappeared by Indian security forces. I remember being stopped at checkpoints with security forces, very aggressively kind of, questioning my family who was traveling in the car. And I remember, my uncle pointing out different ditches and canals along the way where bodies had been removed, individuals who had been reported as having been killed in, encounter killings, which we know are euphemisms for staged shootouts and extrajudicial executions. So all these kind of conversations that were happening within my family and Sikh diaspora communities in the 80s and 90s were very, formative in awakening me to, issues of gross human rights violations. And, as I became a young adult, I was then also, like many people in the diaspora, participating in protests outside of Indian embassies, participating in different commemorative actions to raise our voice about what our understanding was of the atrocities that had happened and the ongoing impunity for these crimes. And I would say these experiences were very formative in me understanding not only the experience of Sikhs, but other communities and groups who had been targeted by the state of India, including Kashmiris, including the people of Nagaland and other states in the Northeast. And it is what motivated, my interest in human rights and ultimately to, pursue a career in that field and start an organization called INSAF. And although our focus is certainly on enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions in Punjab, our launching point was actually a seminal report written by INSAF's co-founder, IkOankar, called 20 Years of Impunity. And now you could easily title that report 40 Years of Impunity, which was about the genocide that was perpetrated in Delhi. And this report, I think, is very significant because it actually looked at 1,300 affidavits that were submitted to two different commissions that had looked into the, quote unquote, Delhi riots. And it's clear from the analysis and the information that we extracted from these affidavits that these attacks, these organized killings were not riots. And in fact, they were very premeditated. And another misconception that I believe that the report definitively clarifies is that not only were these atrocities organized by the Congress Party, but the state was very much instrumental in perpetrating this violence. So it's often kind of, labeled rightly so and attributed as a Congress Party organized atrocity. However, it's clear that very significant state agencies were mobilized to perpetrate this violence at scale. And just to kind of highlight some of those state agencies, we have the Railway Protection Force, we obviously have the Delhi Police, we also have the Indian Army. And so to mobilize these institutions, it went beyond just the Congress Party. So you certainly had significant state actors beyond just the party who were kind of working hand in glove with the architects of these crimes. And, with that report, I would say is what kind of launched INSAF. And it also draws connections between another significant atrocity crime, which was June 84. And I know these are kind of thought of as distinct atrocities, but as we learned in our own work when we were investigating and documenting, human rights violations in Punjab, the practices that we saw in Punjab in 80s and 90s were advented in June 84 and November 84. Specifically, the practice of disposing of the evidence of the state's crimes. And so in June 84, we have the first kind of documentation of mass cremations, where the state, in order to destroy the evidence of their crimes and the extrajudicial killings from that assault, engaged in mass cremations, surreptitious cremations. We saw that practice again in November 84, where the bodies were surreptitiously cremated in mass. Again, activities that were organized by the state. And then we again see this practice unfolding over more than a decade in Punjab, where state security forces, to hide the evidence of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions, are surreptitiously cremating bodies in mass. And so although our focus has kind of very much been Punjab, it was very much informed by the atrocities of June 84 and November 84, and drawing the connection between the practices that were developed and then scaled, you could say, scaled up over the course of a decade.
Thanks a lot, Sukhman. The link to the report that Sukhman mentioned, 20 Years of Impunity, that's in the chat. Hopefully everyone in the audience can see it and can access it. You should also be able to find that through INSAF's website or just by looking up online on Google. But thanks a lot for sharing that personal connection with 1984. And of course, when we talk about 1984, we're talking about years before that and as well as following it, and then how you became engaged in this work. And again, you're really doing this important work of creating a counter narrative to the Indian state through this work. And also how you mentioned that it was, you discovered how it was the Sikh community, but also other communities like people in Kashmir, in the Northeast, who are being who continue to be targeted through these techniques that they started honing and, sort of developing in 1984. Also the language, that's really important. Even though Professor Chakravarti's book, for example, is called Delhi Riots, we have, there has been a great deal of discussion in terms of, how to question and challenge the language of riots itself. And that's something that Swapnan brought up as well. So I'm going to go back to Professor Chakravarti again and, go back a little bit. So go back and forth between the past and present and India and the diaspora. So Professor Chakravarti, can you give us a sense of how the violence of 1984 is being remembered in India today? And I know that you don't necessarily have a survey of what's going on, but just your sense of what people are doing in terms of remembering it today. And if you've seen any shifts since when you first did this work in 1984, and how the violence is remembered now. And if you have any thoughts also on how the violence of 1984 sort of set a precedent for violence against Muslims and other minority communities, because that's especially pronounced today. So the shifts over time in terms of how it's remembered, and any connections that you see between the violence of 1984 and what's unfolding in India now.
Yeah. So to start with, actually, the title. It's true that we shouldn't have called it riots, because it wasn't a riot, okay? But it's the only language, I suppose you assembled that book, and it was the only easy sort of term that everybody understood, that is violence against particular communities at a given point of time. And on hindsight, we may not have had the genocide framework at that stage, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But we certainly could have used pogrom, because it was a one-sided assault upon a people. And a riot requires you to actually have two sets of people who go for each other. And I think that in that sense, the quickness with which we did that work and put it out and so on hindsight, I definitely think that it should have been pogrom. And I think some others began to use pogrom in some of their writing. But, this is how we put it out. That was the easy language that was available. The term genocide itself has been picked up in international circles. It wasn't particularly used, in my opinion. I don't think I was aware of it in India. But we did have to argue and this will answer your other question. See, the second huge assault that we've had, and systematic, it's something to be said for the, what would you call it, the vitality of the Sikh community, that it was able to return. They never forgot 84, okay? It was very important that they continued to remember 84. But there's a way in which they sort of picked up and built their own lives, rebuilt their lives in a certain kind of way. And there were these international connections, and there were groups of people who did become part of the diaspora and kept it going over there. But within India, it seems to me that, for instance, like if we talk about 84, who are the people who talk about 84? Every year, there is an event that is organized, and we are often invited to go there and speak about it. So various categories of people do remember that. To some extent, it's like the partition. The partition is also remembered now by across the globe, beyond the community that was actually suffered that violence. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there is a particular way in which the Sikh community's sense of betrayal. That's why I said 10 years later, after the Rangnath Mishra Commission had come and gone, and Nanavati came and went. I think one of the essays that I wrote at the end of 10 years was this thing which said it's actually the Watan. The women spoke of Hamare Watan mein hi humko mara. So that memory of, look, what is it that we were supposed to be the citizenry of India? We came from the other side, which of course is an interesting statement in itself. So, and yet now in our own country, we have been turned upon. I mean, people turned upon us. So in some ways, I think that hurt has never gone away. 10 years, you mark every time, 10 years, 20 years, 15 years, a whole series of these things. And the fact that you didn't get justice, particularly early on, was striking. But I want to here also flag. So we got to the term genocide after a big battle in the International Tribunal for Justice in Gujarat. And that is because it was an international tribunal, and there were people who would come with, Rhonda Copeland was there, and a couple of others who had worked in the European context were there. This is still pre the, what's it called, the setting up of the International Court, okay? I think it coincides. Maybe Suchitra will be able to highlight that. But what was significant is that the international component was working with the model of the Holocaust. They wanted 6 million dead. And I remember the discussion that we were having. I was the oldest person in that group amongst the Indians, and perhaps amongst the entire crowd. And I was stunned. I couldn't believe that they were saying that that genocide is not to be used in the Gujarat context. Okay. So I then turned around and said, look, this 6 million model doesn't work for us. It is targeted violence. Targeted violence actually is the basis. The pogrom is built around the idea of a particular community that becomes targeted at a certain point of time. And that is the terminology that we have to move. And I have to say, to the credit of the others, is that they immediately saw the value of it. And I said, I'm not going to work with the 6 million, but 2,000 or 1,000 people who are targeted as the victims, consciously targeted, for me is a genocide, okay? Or it's at least a genocidal intent. It's a genocidal move that is being made at the end of the day. And I think that was extremely important from the point of view of trying to understand what had happened to the body politic. And I want to say here that all sections of the democratic community have always, at every stage, stood on the same podium as far as the 84 violence is concerned. But it's also stood and come when the targeted violence had happened in Gujarat. And in fact, the state has played this game on both sides. The Congress party has done it, but the BJP and the right wing has also done it. And they're actually using one to cancel out the other, which is to say, you did it. And at one of these meetings, I was so infuriated. I said, shut up, the two of you. There are a lot of people who have stood against both sort of assaults. And we are actually asking for justice and for command responsibility and whatever it is for everyone. You can't do one cancels out the other is not the way to go, as far as histories of nations also should go up. Forget about the international benchmark, as it were. So in that sense, I think it's extremely important for us to see what happened in 84, how it's been taken. And that search for justice never goes away. And in the final, in the context of 84, some of the, people, trials did proceed. Firstly, it was botched right from the beginning. You had a sort of standard FIR that was written after Mrs. Gandhi's Nirmam Hatya. Crowds collected and did this. And it was a standard, whichever police station you went to, that was the standard FIR. So it was put in place. There was a kind of organized way in which the, let's say, the state was also acting in order to erase the violence. Okay, but I don't know if I should say this now, but or maybe I should say that if I'm going to get another round, I'll bring it up at that stage. But I think that the search for justice is one part of it, and then accountability and betrayal is another. And I do feel very strongly about both those, but I think I'll leave it for the next round.
Thanks so much, Professor Chakravarti. And yes, we will come back to you so you can bring it up then. But thank you. And I completely understand why you use the language of riots, for example, in calling your book that, right? Because it's a product of its time and space. And you're right that the language of genocide was, like you just explained, was not even available. And pogrom was something that you could have labeled it, but it was that language that was in circulation at that point. And it's necessarily, I think, memories and how we make sense of these very difficult events that happen. They don't, that's one of the things about trauma, for example, that it doesn't make sense when it actually happens, and it keeps coming back, and that's why it's also generational. But it's only with the passage of time that we can start, labeling these things, and labels are necessarily going to be inadequate when we're talking about extraordinary events like this violence, right? So I completely understand, but thanks for explaining, the context in which you called your book what you call it, and also for bringing up the fight for language itself and calling it genocide. It is about numbers, but it's definitely about the motivation and the intention behind this violence, right? And Sikhs were targeted in 1984, before and after, but there are other communities, and it's sort of like a design, a pattern that's been set in place. And so that's the question that I'm going to, that's the topic that I'd like for us to continue thinking about. And so for Suchitra, I'm going to ask her about the any connections that you see between the 1984 violence and the violence that continues to be inflicted on Muslims and other minority groups, both in India and the diaspora. And if you see connections, what sort of connections do you see? If there are also some differences between the kind of violence of 1984 and the violence that the current Indian right-wing regime inflicts on minorities, you can talk about some of those differences as well, Suchitra. So
I think let me start with the similarities, which is important for us to build on, and what has happened from that moment to here. I think one of the things that you really see is the ways in which certain kind of state-sanctioned violence, impunity, and who gets co-opted into inflicting violence becomes a systematic institutionalized process from this moment on. This is also to acknowledge that there was other kinds of violence that happens before. India is not new to pogroms. India is not new the kind of violence that becomes endemic in its life, the ways in which violence causes both, creates penal colonies. None of this is new. But what 1984 really does is, one, it happens in the heart of the capital. And here you see people bearing witness in ways. This did not happen in a faraway village. This was not. This does not represent the kind of caste related violence that is inflicted on in rural areas, which is again grotesque and brutal, but away from the media lens. This is the heart of a country's capital. You see the ways in which, as Professor Chakravarti was saying, you had people bearing witness to the kind of people. It was not your certain groups of people. No, this was everybody partook, and everybody who took part. And in the report that NSAF's Sukhman and others have done, and the ones NSAF's co-founder did, it's very clearly they talk about the ways in which those who enabled, incited this violence get rewarded. Right, the reward becomes an essential part of this. There is no remorse, there is no accountability, but you also kind of get a sense of reward as being a part of this violence. Now, the second thing it really does, and begins this idea in which we don't call it vigilante violence when we talk about this work, or in my work. We also don't call them mobs, because mobs often imply an spontaneous combustion. No, we believe the idea of a collective public violence. Collective public violence, the way that we define it, is when the society, the community, and everybody who is part of the fabric is then weaponized to inflict a very particular kind of violence that is then aided, abetted by the state and arms of the state, justified, legitimized. Not only do the state not interfere to stop, there's a difference between actively stopping violence, then there's a difference between standing and allowing the violence to happen, and then being a part of enabling violence. And what you see with 1994 is a very clear, publicly available documentation of this violence not only being sanctioned, but here the collective public violence of enabling the citizen to become the extended arm of the state, as aided by the arms of the state itself, becomes something, a pattern, which then gets replicated. For example, it's very clear that what you see in Gujarat, circulation of lists of people in the electoral list, kind of begins with 1984, where people's electoral lists were available and they were circulated. Where people lived was already predetermined. People knew where to go to target whom. So you were targeting a community and putting a mark on their back. So I think that is something that really begins. And one of the patterns that you see in violence, especially violence that is known, is that because there is no accountability, because there is a reward, every time an act of immense public violence happens, those patterns become taken, perfected, and repeated. You're really building a system that has perfected the art of inciting a very specific kind of violence. And I think that is something that really repeats itself over and over again. Again, we have to understand that history and memory is very local. It doesn't mean that every single act of violence is going to be similar, but what you're really seeing is you're building an infrastructure of impunity, and you're building it through infrastructures of laws that criminalize people. I think those are important. Now, where do we see the differences? So we are not today living in a time of 1984. One, as I already said, there is a very systematic ways in which it is enabled. Second, I think the state has become very good at enacting and enabling this violence. Of course, we have enabled a very specific kind of collective public violence. We talk about it as lynchings and other things, but really what it is making sure that the citizen becomes complicit in the act of state violence. The other things that we really see is the use of media. Back then, I think we have to take account of how media itself has now become, not that media didn't exist back then, not that hate speech wasn't used as a way of incitement, but today the avenues, media has made both violence, punishing, disciplining minoritized, over-policed communities, whether it is the Sikh community, whether it is Muslims, Dalits, Bahujans, Adivasis, across the world, the capacity for media, not only to capture the moment, viralize it, but also the ways in which disinformation and misinformation could proliferate. I think that is something that is definitely very different. I don't know if this has been studied in a very specific way. The other thing I think we've gotten very good at, and I think scholarship, and I think this is something that's very similar to what Professor Chakravarti said, is that we have gotten better with dealing with the language. We've gotten better with understanding where this language is. There is more scholarship that is coming that kind of wants to not only problematize, but understand that language is essential, that we need to use a very specific kind of language, that we need to understand, we have to name the beast in order for us to get it. And I think those are valuable ways in which we kind of engage with this. I think the fact that today more and more scholars understand the role that caste and class play when we talk about this violence becomes important. I think I'll kind of leave it at that. But I think just as we understand the similarities, I think we also have to understand that we are in a place that is far more scarier. The capacity to do that violence is important. And only other thing that I want to add about the genocide or the linguistic aspect of it is that it is never about the numbers. If you go to the genocide memorial in Rwanda, actually has a very specific thing that says that it's never about the numbers, right? In Srebrenica, official numbers are, I think, about a few in the thousands. In Rwanda, it was millions. But in the subcontinent's context, it is more than millions. But again, it happens differently. And I think we have gotten much better with the language, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. Yeah, certainly you're right that it's not. I mean, it's not about numbers. It's about the intention And this idea of the Indian state post-independence being a secular state, that's always been called into question, right? Even before 1984, perhaps blatantly in 1984, and much more blatantly and explicitly today. There is not even a pretense, perhaps, anymore of being secular. So I think those are all sorts of connections. But you're right that there are differences as well, and how the media weaponizes, right, is used as a weapon, weaponizes and perfects the state language and state violence. It's communities talking back through media, but media itself is playing a really important role, and I think that's important. But you're right that the state has also perfected violence through the years, and 1984, sort of became the precursor for that. But there are similarities as well as differences. Sukhman, I'm going to come to you, and just talking about this question that I'd asked Professor Chakravarti earlier about remembering 1984. So in the diaspora, how do you see some of the ways in which people remember 1984, and if you've seen any shifts or changes with time? And so, for example, if there's an increase in memorization, if there's some resistance still. And also, I just want to bring up, there have been recent events where Sikh activists have been targeted by Indian state authorities. So, for example, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was assassinated by Indian state authorities. And if that has had an impact on how people in the diaspora talk about 1984, or perhaps have become more resistant to talking about 1984. I was doing some research just last year and talking to Sikhs right around the time that the assassination happened, and there seemed to be some sort of resistance at the time. So I was just curious if you had any thoughts about how it's changed and how recent events have had an impact.
From the way I experienced it and my observations about how the diaspora engages the issues of the atrocities in '84 and the ensuing decade of disappearance is not one that I would characterize as remembrance. It's better, I think, characterized as opportunities to articulate demands for justice. I think there's a clear recognition that India has become a culture of impunity. Perhaps it always was. And that has led to ongoing and recurring atrocities. There's a clear recognition, even if you speak to the most isolated and uneducated individuals in a rural village in Punjab, or someone who lives in a urban area here in the diaspora, whether it's the Bay Area or New York or the Toronto area, there's a clear recognition that one, there has never been a true accountability or justice, let alone acknowledgement. And as a result, atrocities continue to be committed against Sikhs and other minority populations in India. And so I've never experienced it personally as, I would say, remembrance. Certainly from the perspective of family members whose loved ones have been disappeared or killed, they continue to hold out hope that their loved one may still be alive, perhaps detained in some jail or pit by Indian authorities. And in any case, from the framework from which INSAF operates, which is international law, international public law, enforced disappearances are ongoing crimes. So not only is this not a past crime from that perspective, but the crime actually compounds each day, that the disappearances continue. And then relatedly, victims and survivors have an ever-present right to reparations. So this is, again, a compounding violation of this right to truth, justice, and reparations. And I believe the community, even if they can't, cognize it in those terms, is very aware of the ongoing impact that these atrocities have had. A study that we were involved in, in which we worked with Physicians for Human Rights and NYU's NYU Bellevue Center for Survivors of Torture, involved looking at a random sample of victim families whose case was proceeding before India's National Human Rights Commission. And this relates to the mass cremations case, the case that human rights defender Jaswant Singh Kalra had, his disappearance and killing had initiated. And what they found was that the impact of the not knowing about the true fate of what happened to their disappeared or killed loved one, of not being able to participate in the last rites, in addition to the fact that these surviving family members themselves had often been persecuted and tortured in brutal ways, showed the ongoing impact of the torture and trauma. And they indicated that this exceeded, rates of depression and trauma even exceeded what they had observed in, conflicts in the Balkans. And so I believe that, again, to kind of come to the point that this is a unfolding reality. And 84 was the beginning of this nightmare and not kind of an event that has somehow concluded. I forget kind of what I apologize, the second component of your question was.
I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about, so with recent developments like Sikh activists being assassinated in the diaspora, if that has had an impact in some ways.
Absolutely. And I think the transnational repression and this, targeted global assassination program that India has architected speaks to a point that Suchitra had made, just prior, that there is a reward mechanism that's built into these atrocities. So to bring it back to Punjab before I kind of go global, there's a clear pattern of security officials being rewarded and promoted for their willingness and the actual perpetration of gross human rights violations, whether that's torture or enforced disappearances or unlawful killings. We've seen them rise through the ranks very precipitously because of their willingness to produce bodies. And in fact, in Punjab, throughout the years, there's been litigation by officers who are not willing to commit these atrocities and who are passed over by, even non-gazetted officers. So people who technically should never have been allowed to become senior officers because they were not on that track or being promoted into these senior positions. And that reward mechanism, obviously we see both individuals being rewarded. We also see the reward at the party level, where the parties who have orchestrated this violence reap victories at the election poll. So this is often a prelude and a setup to galvanizing a base for to kind of influence kind of electoral outcomes. And we see all of that continue to unfold today, where the individuals who are killed in Canada, in Pakistan, who are under threat of assassination, are being targeted by agencies, namely the Research and Analysis Wing and India's National Investigative Agency, which were up until very recently led by two officials, Sumant Goyal and Dinkar Gupta, both of whom were senior officials in Punjab police who committed atrocities. And you see that these individuals were rewarded and promoted through the years, and then went on to lead the most powerful security agencies in India. And until very recently, and I believe it's directly connected to the global assassination program, the fact that it was exposed in a very embarrassing fashion for India, that these two individuals were very recently removed. And so I think there's a clear connection between the impunity for the atrocities in 84 and afterwards, and also who has favor with the Indian state. It's individuals who are willing to engage in gross human rights violations, law be damned.
Right. Thank you, Sukhman. Yeah. So yeah, so you're talking about you're raising a really important point about how it's about memory, but perhaps less about memory, but something that's ongoing, and it's not really finite, because people are still searching for justice and still living in the hope for justice, especially in the sort of work that you do with the disappeared, right, or people who sort of live these liminal in between lives. And the structure of punishment, which is very, very the structure of rewards, actually, which is very concerning, right? That how it's being institutionalized and being, honed and sharpened over time. That's really concerning. We're getting close to the end, so we still have a few minutes. I want to take in audience questions. We have, I think, a comment and a question here already. If you can please start sending your questions, that'll be great. Perhaps I'll read out these questions and comments, and if there's time, I do have a few more questions for our panelists. If there's time, I can share my questions, but I do want to foreground some of these comments from the audience. So Paramjeet writes, I think it's mostly a comment for Professor Chakravarti. Hope for justice. Hope for justice continues even after 40 years, especially by the victims staying in widow colonies. But as a civil rights activist have gone through the same pain, we are concerned by the views of the second and third generation who say justice is not only delayed but denied and are losing hope. Some have slipped and many are slipping and becoming tools in the hands of, I'm not sure what they mean by that last term there. But yeah, so basically just sharing their thoughts. There's a question for Suchitra. Rajurshri from New Delhi writes, could you please further break apart or elaborate, aside from the understanding that local violence has its own dimensions, its implications in terms of setting particular precedents that continue to inform power dynamics, intercommunity relations, and finding one's place in the larger body politic? I wonder if you can read the question, Suchitra.
I can. Yes,
okay.
I can.
I think so. It's about the perhaps focusing on intercommunity relations. It actually ties in also with one of the questions that I had for you. One of the, in terms of like what might non-Sikhs or non-minority or majority Hindu community members do to extend solidarity and support to communities that are being minoritized and criminalized constantly? Maybe we can tie it in with that, and just like intercommunity relations, if you have any thoughts about that.
So what I'm going to do is maybe we could share the thread that I had shared earlier. One is what's happening in Uttarakhand. Last year at the Police Project, we started putting together a Twitter thread, which kind of every single day documented this project of ethnic cleansing, where we were very clear from the local activists and the journalists that we work with that the intent was very clear. This was an experiment to ethnically cleanse a very particular town. And for over a year, if you look at the thread, Shruti, would it be possible for people to kind of maybe see it? It could be shared. It's the Twitter thread, and then I can share the other page.
Manvinder, can we possibly share the screen?
If not, then if you could just share those two links, I think that'd be a good way.
I think she shared the link already, but if you can possibly, yeah, perfect. I think she's trying the screen share.
So this is the thread. It started on the 8th of June last year. And if you go through the thread, if you scroll through it, what you see is that it's an update that happens every other day in a very local way. And it kind of says that this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then you see how the local community has its own specificities. It has its own allies. It has its people who have to work together, and the ways in which these individual acts begin to kind of tear it apart. The implication, I just want to kind of trying to understand the question. So in terms of setting precedents, what you're really seeing is that you've seen these instances where you start with one community, and this is true of the demolitions as well. You start with one community and you say, we're going to figure out what's happening. Let's see to what extent we can push the institutions, the peoples, the communities to succumb very quickly. When will they not speak? And I think once those contours of silence is established, because I think what's really happening here is illegal, it's extrajudicial, it's unconstitutional, we all know it. But what emerges from all of this is the fact that no one is challenging this this violence, this unconstitutionality, this illegality. So what you're really establishing is a particular kind of contours of silence, which then becomes solidified, right? And I think that's what you're doing. And I think this is where the inter-community aspect comes in, because once you've created these contours of silence, these silence also run across communities, right? You can no longer speak what is right or wrong. You can only speak in defense of your community. Journalist Raj Shekhar's book, Despite the State, has this exceptional moment in the Gujarat chapter where each community, the Hindu community within Gujarat, has been so policed and self-segregated that as a Gujarati Hindu, a particular caste, you can only help people from your particular caste. It's no longer, of course, united by anti-Muslim hate, but you could only, you could only give houses to people from within your caste, within your community, within your. So the ways in which this kind of breaking apart of the fabric of the society plays out. And I think I would really urge people to look at. I think that moment that Raj Shekhar describes in Despite the State is another example of ways in which communities get defragmented. The other second question about what can people do, and I think the most important thing that people who come from majority communities, people who come from communities that hold a certain kind of privilege in a very Hindu India, is to start in your own living rooms. Have conversations about history, have conversations especially about caste, have conversations about privilege, have conversations about anti-Muslim bigotry, about anti-caste violence, caste bigotry and prejudice. And I think for me, one of the things that we do at home is I have an 8-year-old, and it is to kind of understand, for me, the best way I could describe it is to raise a good human being, you have to become an exceptionally better self of you. So for me, it is having conversations about what does it mean to raise a child without caste. It is not denial of caste. It is not lack of acknowledgement of your own complicity and your own locations. But what does it mean to raise a child as someone who's anti-caste, who understands how bigotry works, who understands how Islamophobia works? What does it mean for us to teach allyship from a very young age? Those are much harder questions. And I don't think there are right answers, but I think the biggest change has to happen in our living rooms. We cannot go talk about equality and justice outside, but refuse to figure out what that looks in our own living rooms. We cannot talk about secularism outside, but refuse to challenge the everyday. I mean, let's be honest, an average upper caste Hindu home today is a deeply violent casteist home. The kind of things that get spoken are deeply violent, and our children learn from that. And I think it is important that we started. I don't think Sikhs or minoritized communities or Muslims or Bahujans or Adivasis need saving from as a majority. They want us to learn and fix our own communities first. So maybe perhaps for me, it really does start at the living room and what we can do within our communities. And of course, constantly keep listening to what others need from us, what kind of solidarity they expect from us. I think that's also important. Solidarity is not what we choose to give. It is how we turn up for them the way they want us to. And that has a material cost. It comes at a huge cost. And I think those are the things that I would definitely think about.
Right. Thanks so much, Suchitra. Right. So it's so important to make the connection between the micro and everyday and what we're doing at the macro level, and not making assumptions in terms of what people expect us to do, but be open to listening to what they have to say. If people want to share more questions, we do have some more time. In the meantime, I'm going to maybe ask some other questions that I have for our panelists. So going back to Professor Chakravarti. Yeah, Professor Chakravarti, whatever you want to say, go ahead and do that. And if you want to reflect a little bit on your positionality as well, we talked about it earlier. You talked about how you did not necessarily see yourself or identify yourself as Hindu when you were writing the book or doing this work in 1984. Anything that you want to talk about with respect to your positionality, and anything else that comes to mind? I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I'll quickly take the question of positionality. I think is, well, it's perhaps it's important, but perhaps it's also not, because if you come at it from a different history, someone like me is born before partition, born before the nation is formed. You enter the what's it called, the public sphere, understanding yourself as a member of a larger community, and you didn't see yourself as necessarily A, B, C, D till some of it started to hit you in the face in a certain kind of way. Now, I will leave that aside, but there was a question that was asked, and I think this is important, because what do we choose to focus on and what do we choose to erase? That's a question that I also want to put over here, because in the context of 1984, and that's the question that I think was raised by Paramjeet and so on. See, the point is, we have gone back. We members of the PUDR, we've gone back now to the community that actually faced the worst violence, and I mentioned the resettlement colonies. Now, these two, targeted violence in these two large slum dwellings, as it were, saw the largest slaughter. It led to some kind of relocation and whatever it is. But it's a community that was actually forgotten. And it was forgotten by everybody, including the Sikhs, who may have been talking about the international dimensions of it. So for me, and I want to bring gender in here, see, it is 3,000 widows, 3,000 women who were the testifiers of the 84 violence. They are the ones who saw, because the men were either being killed or they were in hiding. And this was stated to us. So these women have borne the entire struggle for justice. They've gone to the court repeatedly and back, but they've also suffered depredations in their own family. It's a situation in which next generation and the next generation is carrying those wounds. So at the end of the day, I think it's very important, when we do talk about violence, let's also talk about, what we want to focus on. How do you want to repair? Reparation is a very important aspect of, reconcile, to bringing back a normalcy, a state of being. And while there is no overt tension between Hindus and Sikhs anymore, the fact of the matter is that everybody has forgotten the survivors of 84. And I see that as really tragic. And some of our interviews are indicating that these women have, it's like, they've been abandoned by everybody. And I feel very strongly about that. So at the end of the day, when we tell the story, let's also tell it in a way that it is. And I won't put in, because accountability, I mean, I never see myself as a Hindu. I see myself as a citizen of India. And so for me, what happens with the missing and the disappeared in Kashmir is as important as the disappearances that have happened and at this point of time now, you can't even speak about it, but we have people who have demanded accountability from the state. So you have Parveena Hangar, saying, where is my son? I want an answer. What happened to him? So accountability is something that we are not demanding of the state, and we've let it go. So we will have new rounds of people who experience violence, and we'll just move on, because it's such a violent, complex moment, as I see it, that we will just abandon each group and move on, and I don't think that's the way to be. That's not the story of my people, of my country. I don't want to live with that story, So it's a challenge for all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Chakravarti. Yeah, and it is a challenge. And I think coming to the diaspora, it's interesting that, you know, the ways in which identities are constructed and performed in the diaspora, there is a difference between how these identities are constructed and performed in the diaspora versus in India. That's one thing. But what you talked about, like the differences within the Sikh community, the fragmentation within, how there are communities within the community that splits within the community that are not necessarily talked about or addressed or are forgotten. And certainly the question of accountability, because it all keeps getting normalized, right? We just sort of develop a sense of apathy that this is just something that we live with now, and there is no sense of shock or betrayal or outrage. And that's very concerning. We have two more questions or comments from audience members that I'll just share. And, maybe if Sukhman wants to respond to some of this, and Suchitra and Professor Chakravarti too. Manvinder shared the link for the book that Suchitra mentioned, Despite the State by M. Rajashekhar, in chat if people want to look that up. So one of the questions that we have, I'm just going to read these together. So maybe because we are, we're short on time, I'll read these together. So and I'll give Sukhman the first chance to respond to them, and then maybe Suchitra and Professor Chakravarti if we have time. Ishmeet writes, I'm so impressed by all the work you're all doing to continue to keep this topic top of the mind and helping the Sikh community in their quest for justice. Thank you. Beyond supporting some of the projects monetarily, what practical 2 or 3 actions can you advise us to take to help change the narrative on impunity related to 1984 and more broadly other pogroms in India and abroad? And then there's a question from Gurpreet who writes, I'm trying to understand human psyche from social and history lens of humanity. 500 years ago, Guru Nanak Sahib writes that the rulers are like tigers or lions, and their officials are dogs who harass and persecute the innocent subjects. The rulers suck the blood of the public through these dogs who lick the wounds. Today, we are remembering the Sikh genocide or liquidating political activists as Naxalites. What tools can be used to bring a change at human level where governments or people in power don't do this othering? In some ways, they're kind of related. So some thoughts about future directions or some things that we can do to help change the narrative. Sukhman, I'm going to see if you have thoughts about these questions.
I'll try to kind of address both questions with the same thoughts. I'd like to highlight actually a case that of a human rights defender that has been, very inspirational to Insaf. And June 8th actually marked his the 30th anniversary of his disappearance. So I think the case of Jaswant Singh Kalra is well known, but another individual that is much less well known is that of Sukhwinder Singh Patti. He was a lawyer based in Sangrur district of Punjab, and he engaged in very creative lawyering where he was able to get individuals who were in police remand transferred to judicial custody by filing a particular type of petition in the Punjab and Haryana High Court. By doing this, he was able to actually foil numerous what would have been fake encounters. So often people who are held in Punjab police stations at that time are tortured and then killed in these staged encounters. And by getting these individuals removed from police custody and put in judicial custody or jail, he was able to increase the likelihood that these individuals would survive. As a result, he himself, Sukhwinder Singh Patti, was ultimately picked up, tortured, and disappeared by Punjab police. And that happened 30 years ago on June 8th. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that case is because I think it exemplifies how, in this case, through lawyering, you can actually resist and, make a real contribution to these issues of human rights. And relatedly, I want to highlight his case because I think one of the questions was, beyond kind of giving money to these, different causes and organizations, how can we participate? I would encourage people to become familiar with the resources that are available. Polis Project puts out incredible content. Professor Chakravarti's work is still highly relevant. Insaf has a lot of resources, whether it's videos or reports or other kind of interactive tools that kind of connect the dots between different types of data, I would really encourage you to familiarize yourself with this and disseminate this information and hold conversations, because I think one, by educating yourself, you can kind of speak to specifics, but I think you can also draw a lot of inspiration. Of course, these people were victims, but there was also a huge amount of courage and resilience and love that's exemplified in this documentation. And I think you yourselves can kind of draw inspiration from that, and perhaps it'll inspire you to kind of think of solutions both at the local level and, regionally and globally.
Thanks so much, Sukhman. And Manvinder just shared the link, the work that INSAF does, and the digital archive that they've created on mapping crimes against humanity and enforced disappearances. So the link is right there. Suchitra and Professor Chakravarti, do you have any thoughts or closing thoughts on those questions, or anything else related to 1984 and remembering it? Whoever wants to go first. Suchitra, do you want to go first? And then maybe Professor Chakravarti can help us.
Yeah. I think for me, this question, I'm reminded of this moment in Midnight's Borders. There's a really powerful moment when, again, this happens in Nagaland. The person I'm talking to says something incredibly powerful. And the idea is that when you are powerless, time will acquit every crime against you. So for me, the older I get, I feel that building power as community, across community, it's become, I feel, the way for us to move forward. Building power is very different than occupying political positions of power. When I say building power, I think that building power is an act of community. It's an act of being in conversation with each other. It's the act of calling people in. And I think we need to learn what it means for the South Asian. I've now lived outside of India for so long that I feel more and more difficult speaking about India itself, but I feel perhaps it's this odd position where I don't know where I fit in quite well, but I feel, at least as someone in the diaspora now, I think we need to build power, and building that power becomes the basis of us challenging state impunity, challenging, and I'll just leave it at that. And
that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Suchitra. Yeah, Professor Chakravarti, any thoughts on those questions or any closing comments that you have?
Just the fact that I suppose if you take this long journey starting off from, if we treat 84 as a marker and then you proceed to later ones, just from the narrative, just from the anecdotal stuff that I mentioned, there is a way in which at least feminists have managed to, and others, civil rights activists also and so on, I think you've moved from the question of numbers and state responsibility and so on to actually terms that allow us to understand what is happening to whichever community it's happening. So if it's happening with the Sikhs, you understand it. If it's happening to the Muslims, you understand it. If it's happening to the Kashmiris, you understand it better. So in a sense, I think that question of reparations, of accountability, of command responsibility, of the way to go is not necessarily individual justice, because individual justice is difficult to, but to pinpoint command responsibility. And some of us did some work on creating a communal violence bill. Nothing came of it. Nobody is interested. Certainly anybody in the state is not going to be interested in it. But the fact is that we were trying to put a structure in, as a system in place in which the aggrieved survivor of the violence has a way and a system to actually have their grievances addressed. Now, the struggle will not end because you can see from everything that we've all said that it's actually the groups that they have brought under this rubric is ever expanding, and more groups are coming in. And I think at the end of the day, from the point of view of the society we want to build and the country that you want to be a part of, is you have to actually expand that pool by which you actually address the violence that is targeted and which is allowed to go under the carpet.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time and for this excellent discussion. I wish we had more time. I had more questions. I'm sure if we had more time, audience members had more questions as well. But there are all of these wonderful resources on all your great work that's available for people, for all of us to engage with, to read, to learn from. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak with you. And I hope I'll get another chance to, talk with you individually or in another setting like this soon. So thank you very much again. I'm going to hand it back to Manvinder.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly sign us out. Again, thank you so much, everyone, Dr. Devgan, Professor Chakravarti, Suchitra, Sukman, and for everyone that joined us today. And as always, tune into the Sikh Cast, a podcast produced by SikhRI, where we explore various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in today. Today's webinar will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.